Good afternoon, everyone. As just been introduced in such fulsome terms as that, I hope I can live up to it. But I'm Tim Devenport. I'm with the ISNI International Agency, and I'd like to say something this afternoon about the nuts and bolts of ISNI, which, as most of you will probably know by now, is the International Standard Name Identifier. But before starting, I really must thank Anne, Sophie and their organising committee for putting together this splendid event. And it's great to see so many ISNI enthusiasts out there as well. Thank you for that. In the time available, I'm going to try to address a number of pretty varied topics today, starting off with what is ISNI, what's it for, and who's using it. For those of you newer to ISNI, I'll attempt to lift the veil slightly on how this all happens, how we keep it running, certainly not just me, but myself and a whole network of collaborators. The ISNI database is out there as a very usable resource and a valuable resource, I think, which I'd encourage you to contribute to and to use. As you see here, under another point on this slide, ISNI is often thought of in conjunction with individuals, the names of individuals, but we like organisations too. And I'll return to that topic later on because this is something that's receiving quite some interest at the moment. I'd like to conclude with a few words on how we coexist with other identifiers in the metadata ecosphere, what we've been doing to document and publicise ISNI, and I'm happy to take a few questions, probably best at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. A quick reminder of the nature and purpose of ISNI. As many of you know, it's an ISO standard for identifying the names of various parties in creative supply chains. ISNI is a sibling of other well-known ISO standards like the ISBN that you'll be familiar with for books, ISSN for periodicals, ISRC, musical recordings, and so on. More rigorously, ISNI provides a way of identifying public personas, if you'd like to call it that, real names, stage names, pseudonyms, and so on, of various kinds for all sorts of contributors. The presentations this morning have already hinted at this, but you're probably realizing that ISNI data subjects can include composers, performers, visual artists, researchers, all sorts, you name it, and those connected with the performing arts as well, if we can get some of them into the database. I'll come back to that topic a bit later on. And of course, there are those polymaths who defy easy description or being placed in a silo. You'll see some brief metrics here on this slide. ISNI has been around since 2011, 2012, when it first came into existence, and well over 14 million ISNIs have been assigned to date. Next slide, please. So what does an ISNI look like? Here are the key features: uniqueness, persistence, standard presentation, and association with a set of carefully selected metadata. The ISNI itself is just a dumb number, but of course unique, a 16-digit string, including a check digit. Using some examples, we can show that multiple provenance is pretty common in many domains, by which I mean that the same identity might well be reported by many contributing sources. ISNI is very much a teamwork exercise. It's very much a multi-contribution networked affair. So in the light of these multiple contributions, you see, for instance, on this slide that Taylor Swift has had at least 28 separate sources who've contributed their own record to actually substantiate or corroborate the identity, while others, Frank Sinatra has 35 such sources. And I guess we might call this, on one level, curated crowdsourcing. But again, I'll come back to that term a little bit later on, if I may. In contrast, some ISNIs are based on single sources who have supplied rich supporting metadata. So, for example, when I last checked, only the US Library of Congress had so far contributed information to ISNI about Sonny Boy Williams, the great blues guitarist. Next slide, please. ISNI is a system, and ISNIs themselves are intended to perform a range of functions. So at a high level, we can discern a number of generic issues: disambiguation, attribution of works to creators, bridging between multiple schemas, and various kinds of system and data interoperability that are frequently encountered across many creative spheres or domains. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Moving from the generic to the more specific, ISNIs can help practitioners manage a range of real-world tasks, such as you see here, which hopefully strike a chord with one or two of you in the audience. Remember, though, that ISNI is only addressing one part of the metadata puzzle. For instance, we're not trying to create multiple or competing catalogues of works and so on. We're very much associated with identifying the creative entities that are behind these ISNI numbers, and that keeps us busy enough as it is. So, for example, of that, ISNI holds in its database significant numbers of ISRCs and track names for musical performers, or ISBNs and book title data for authors. We use that other work or manifestation-related data to assist us in record matching, disambiguation, and unique identity assignment. But as I say, it's really not our aim in any way to offer or replicate catalogues, compilations, or registries of works. We're quite busy enough on the identity side of the puzzle. Next slide, please. Of course, like other identifiers, and particularly at the outset, ISNI could have fallen prey to the single telephone problem. They're not much use on their own, and they're not much use if others don't know about them. But ISNI positively thrives on openness, wide disclosure, and public availability of all the assigned ISNI identifiers. The more people know about them, the more useful they become. Putting ISNI to work in key workflows starts to reveal the power and utility of the standard. I've singled out for particular attention here publishing workflows, but there are others that are very similar. Next slide, please. And the same is true on the input side as well. I can't stress enough the importance of our membership and all those who contribute information, expertise, and time, maintaining and developing ISNI further. Next slide, please. So where does ISNI's information come from? As you'll see, this is very much a question of global teamwork, where our membership, and particularly our registration agencies, such as the KBR, each act as expert gatekeepers in their own domain or area of specialization. And this can be subject area specialization, or it can be linguistic, or various other subdivisions. The default setting, as far as we're concerned, is that as much of this information as possible is effectively public domain. But we do make special provision if there are reasons why the contributing source actually wants something to be retained as confidential. Examples might be, for instance, date of birth or something like this, where the information is primarily submitted to us to help disambiguate between other records. But there is actually a request from the registration agency concerned for one or more elements to actually be held confidential from the public records. It's worth mentioning in passing as well that not all of the data comes in via registration agencies directly, but we're seeing a small but growing number of self-service user portals. You might have seen some of those maintained by the BANQ in Quebec, British Library, the IDA in Moscow, Sound Credit in the States, and various others, which are aimed to allow facilities for the general public, particular communities, to request that ISNIs be assigned. We place a very high premium on data quality and accuracy, and I'm glad that seems to be working through to the lived experience as far as some of you are concerned. We don't, by any means, guarantee that everything will always be absolutely correct, particularly since we've got this multiple sourcing going on. But we do our best in that regard, and particular role in all of that is played by the ISNI quality team. staffed by the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, who are central to ISNI's operations and its controls. Next slide, please. So now we've covered the nature and purpose of the ISNI standard. We'll have a quick look at the organisations that sustain it. Here are the main entities that you're likely to encounter in your dealings with ISNI. The acquisition agency, think of this as our outsourced technical and IT partner, maintains the engine of ISNI assignment and the database that we've created. This service is supplied by our colleagues at OCLC in the Netherlands, whom you may already have parallel dealings with through WorldCat and various other services. The quality team I just spoke about earlier on, who are the guardians of our technical and data standards, they also supply training, guidance and support to members of ISNI and also the general public. This, as I say, is a co-production between the colleagues in Boston Spa in the UK, from the British Library, and the BNF in Paris. Myself, I represent the International Agency, and we're formally speaking the registration authority for ISNI. We're contracted by ISO to actually promulgate the standard and drive its further use across the world. And the last one I mentioned just here is that we also have a technical advisory committee chaired by Emma Rogos from the British Library. And this looks after proposing, scrutinising and prioritising development requests, because it's not, ISNI is not really a static system. There are various new facilities being introduced or phased in over the course of time. Next slide, please. Yes, that's all-important membership. Some numbers here about the number of organisations who are actually involved and our increasing span, both geographically and in terms of specialist domains. You can see that we've got approaching 40 registration agencies now located across 25 countries. As I said at the end of this slide, we've got a gratifyingly large and strong pipeline of other organisations who are interested in joining us, one of which, a streaming service in Norway, just signed up with us Friday of last week. So it's very much a moving target in the best possible way. I should say, maybe in passing as well, just for clarity, that unlike some other identifiers like ISBN or ISSN, any of ISNI's registration agencies can, if they so choose, provide ISNI services to customers in any country. So there isn't that national exclusivity that features in the setup with some of those other organisations, and we don't have any exclusivity arrangements, whether on topic or on territory. Next slide, please. One of the fascinating aspects of working with ISNI, as far as I'm concerned, is its appeal across a number of different sectors. It's probably true to say that ISNI was rather library-centric during its formative years, but while library interest has remained very strong, which is very gratifying, others, notably in the music industry and in book publishing, are very keen too on adapting ISNI or giving serious consideration to that. I wanted, in that regard, I've enjoyed many of the presentations thus far, and none more so than that by Luc Van Leen just before lunch today. And I wanted to make a few remarks there on what Luc was saying, and probably to follow up with him during the coffee break later on, if I can. Importantly, and this is a really important thing, I was tremendously enthused by Luc's evangelism for ISNI, and I'm glad that, in principle, that he finds it, a useful resource and methodology for approaching, in his case, the whole question of the performing arts. The other thing I'd probably mention is that what Luc may have viewed as a disappointing snapshot reaction or snapshot content from ISNI at the moment for the performing arts is linked very directly to whether or not there's a sponsoring organisation behind it. It's no accident, for instance, that in the library world, with so many libraries engaged, probably 20, 25 libraries engaged actively in ISNI, that there are very many records for literary persons, for those who have published things, for those who've archived things in the past. I'm pretty sure that shall we say, the relative dearth of information in the performing arts area is simply because we need participation and we need data contributors to tell us who these people should be. We'd be tremendously interested in actually following through on that and seeing if we can change the size of those pie diagrams so that they're more representative of the performing arts communities in Europe and indeed across the world. So it will be good, I think, that Luke can collaborate with a local registration agency here in the KBR. But the more that we can actually get hold of the information, the more that we can spread it out and make it widely available. Next slide, please. I have a pretty strong belief that this continued growth that we see in ISNI is because the standard can address a number of important generic needs, whilst at the same time remaining flexible enough to incorporate or respond to sector-specific terminologies or requirements or whatever. And maintaining the balance and relevance of the standard has led ISNI to establishing a number of consultation groups, which are turning out to be great sounding boards as well as positive hotbeds of new suggestions. You see on the slide now that so far we have 4 very active consultation groups catering to different communities, the libraries, book publishing, music and the research sector. It's likely that we'll be opening another one fairly soon, as we've seen an increasing uptake of interest in the world of rights management and copyright. So again, it's really important, we feel, that we tap into the communities so that we can draw on and react to the community's knowledge and prioritization in those various fields. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are some of the challenges that we're facing or have faced over the past 10 years, and some of them we've resolved already. But you see here some of the things. Again, I go back to my statement earlier on that ISNI is by no means a kind of a static entity. It's grown and changed and developed over the past years, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. And we've got challenges of scale. We've got facilities which weren't foreseen when we first operated the database, and we're trying to introduce those as we go on. Next slide, please. But as this slide says, first priority is keeping the lights on. In other words, maintaining the basic service. In the midst of all this growth and diversity and change, many of the essentials of authority, file and identity management need to proceed smoothly in the background. So we're conscious that we have to do that at the same time. Next slide, please. In thinking about this talk, Anne suggested that it might be useful to say a few words about how you or your organisation can actually interact with ISNI data, which you'll recall we positively encourage. Well, here are what you might call the kind of workhorse methods for interacting with the ISNI database. And there may be facilities or particular information that would be useful to your own organisation. So there are ways of actually getting in, whether you're in membership or whether you're just a member of the public or have another specialist interest. We've got manual interaction routes. We have several APIs for searching and for ISNI requirement. We have download facilities for individual records or multiple records. And then if you are associated with a registration agency or member organisation, like the KBR, for instance, then there are other facilities that come into play, like APIs for ISNI assignment and various other things that you see there. Next slide, please. Okay. Alongside the increasing volumes of ISNI assignments that are carried out year on year, The ISNI system itself is being developed further as we go along. There is, of course, already a set of facilities that I've just mentioned in place for interacting with the database, as shown here, two main APIs for search and for assignment, and a web interface. We're continuing to explore changes or additions to these facilities in response to user requests. And 4 of the things that we're either busy with or have recently completed, you see on the slide here today, enhanced facilities in the APIs that we use. The deployment of the so-called deduplication crawler. Since we actually we take in information from many contributing sources, managing down duplication within that database is a considerable responsibility. Much of that we perform manually at the moment by spot checks and interventions like that. We can also react to requests from the public if they see 2 or more records that actually appear to correspond to the same entity. Then our quality team can actually take care of that, do the necessary research, merge the records, or split them if identities have been confused in a particular record. But we need to do this kind of thing at more scale as well, and the idea is that we institute this so-called crawler, which is going to be alerting us to the possibility of duplications, which we can then follow through and identify and rectify. The main constraint we face here, probably in common with many of your own organisations, is a very tight development budget. Obviously, we're looking for partnerships that we can involve other parties with or get sources of external funding. But after that, we have to take some hard choices within our means, as it were, to actually activate and carry through some of the changes which the consultation groups are viewing as high priority. Next slide, please. We've been wondering when or whether I've mentioned linked data in all of this. One of the ISNI outputs that we hope is already and maybe of some increasing relevance to this audience are our own linked data offerings. I listened with great interest to yesterday's descriptions of LOD-based projects and hope that in due course ISNI will be able to contribute more fully to this development than it can at the moment. Next slide, please. That's right. Because of resource constraints, we've had to phase the introduction of what we've been able to offer in this area. So we've developed a serialization and various extract mechanisms that expose ISNI-related data, so the identifiers and a selected subset of the supporting metadata in a couple of flavors, RDF XML and JSON LD. I've noticed from what I've listened to so far that there seems to be a preponderance of JSON LD implementations out there at the moment, but we've covered off a couple to start with anyway. And what we've been able to do so far is to make available JSON LD records either for manual download for single records or for comprehensive data dumps. And I think, again, going back to what Luke was saying earlier on, I think this is probably what he was referring to in terms of the 18 gigabit download, which I hope didn't break any of his facilities when it arrived size-wise. But that's already available. You can see more about that. I'm going to put some more links in the presentation before it's published, and you'll be able to see where you can find out much more information about that mechanism. Phase 2 of the whole thing is making it dynamic, real-time, and so on, introducing a reverse proxy for controllable and secure operation, and making content negotiation fully automated rather than having to go through static dumps and this kind of thing. Next slide, please. Not least because of the breadth and sometimes complexity of what ISNI does, we feel that we have a particular responsibility to the global and disparate communities that it serves to offer clear and accessible documentation. as mentioned here, we have already a solid base of existing, largely technical documentation and descriptions. We're now looking as an ongoing task to supplement these documents with three different types of offerings. An ISNI manual as a sort of reference work on the virtual shelf, a series of mini documents that will be of the nature of how do we do this and so on, you know, two or 3 pages maximum, that kind of size. More work on FAQs and so on, and also developing best practice guides. We've already done something in the area of pseudonym handling, and there are other areas where there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer about how you should interact with ISNI, but we have strong recommendations, and so we'll try to keep making those available. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier on that we don't only deal with individuals, but we also have ISNIs for organisations. Much of the kind of traction for ISNI in its first decade has focused on individuals, even though the organisational applications are in our mandate, in our charter, as it were, right from the word go. And this is seeing increasing use in recent years. We've got 1.5 million organisational ISNIs that are already in place, and we expect to see more. There is at the moment quite some strong interest in different areas about modelling parts of the ecosphere. So, for instance, modelling the relations between music publishers and music imprints and so on, which is a fairly obvious kind of example, or music labels, that kind of thing. And we're seeing that kind of organisational linkage where you're actually calling out not only the individuals involved, but the parent organisation and any relational links between them. I think that will only intensify over the periods to come. And just to say in passing that music groups, whether that's groups or bands or orchestras or whatever it might be, in ISNI terms, these correspond to organisations. So the metadata requirements are slightly different from those in place for individuals, but you can identify the high-level entity and the individuals who relate to or are involved with or are linked to that entity. Next slide, please. Identifiers for persons and organisations. We're not alone. Or as disclaimers on advertisements might put it, other identifiers are available. My lengthy to-do list, one of the more persistent items is to write a clear and balanced comparison of what these and other identifiers from the same ecosphere as ISNI actually do, or what they are. Now, all of them, like IPI, ORCID, VIAF, and various others, all of them are completely valid and all serve slightly or very different needs. I think it's definitely something that's been reflected in the applications that I've heard about over the last couple of days, that you're already in the situation where you're collecting and exposing multiple identifiers for related objects and so on. That's really where we want to position ourselves also from ISNI. So it's a question of peaceful cooperation rather than competition between these particular areas. Pending the completion of my magnum opus on this subject, I would stress ISNI's key characteristics. It's open and it's public, it's persistent, it's curated rather than crowdsourced, both for the initial assignment requests, which come via the registration agencies, and for any corrections or changes that might be done later by the quality team, as somebody mentioned earlier on. ISNI and ORCID cooperation probably warrants a few words. There's specifically, there is quite a large overlap in some areas, particularly in the research sector, where it's quite common for individuals to have both ISNIs and ORCIDs, or one or other, or both of those identifiers. we've had in place for something like 7 or 8 years, and we recently have improved and upgraded it, a memorandum of understanding between ISNI and ORCID, laying out various areas where we feel that we can collaborate, cooperate usefully between the organisations. We also, on a much more basic level, we share the same namespace for the identifiers, so the namespace of the 16-digit codes, and we have in place agreements between the organisations about which ones are ISNIs and which ones are ORCIDs to prevent any accidental collision between them. I'll come back to any of that question afterwards, but I think really as I say, the features of openness, being of a public nature, being a bridge identifier by design, are things which set ISNI apart in various ways, and actually make it a useful identifier across sectors and across various communities. I'd like to turn finally for the moment to communication. Next slide, please. Thank you. Over past years, ISNI has probably on occasion been rather more concerned with quote-unquote doing stuff at the expense of the equally important step of telling people what we've been doing. This has been a combined sort of organisational and resource-based issue that we've grappled with over the years. But over the last 2 years, we've deliberately set out to remedy this situation and perception. And we hope that, that some of this has changed to the good over that period. We started off by getting a communications specialist on board, and some of you will already have dealt with our communications officer, Elena Marie Bassett, which is, her involvement has brought very welcome energy, skills and expertise to the task over the years. And has resulted in, we think anyway, significant progress across the board. Our e-newsletter, ISNI News, has settled down to a fairly predictable quarterly publication, rather than erratic, I think was probably the appropriate description before. We have a stream of news releases, press releases, this kind of thing, news items. I think the social media presence is considerably improved over the past couple of years, admittedly from a pretty low base. And as I say, on another level, interactions via the consultation groups. I should mention in passing, actually, that we've been particularly aided in a lot of this by BDS, and you'll be hearing from Jenny Wright a little bit later here, who's representing one of our newer registration agencies, but BDS also have a web resource hosting and design element, and they've been partners with us through all of this, and very useful too. Thank you, Jenny. So those are some of the things. I mean, obviously those are ongoing actions and so on, but we hope making it a bit more obvious what ISNI is doing, what it's trying to do, why it would like your input. Next slide, please. This is by way of contact points and so on. You've been very patient thus far, and I'm conscious that time is at a premium, so I'll stop at this point with the hope that you've picked up some items of information, useful or otherwise, about ISNI along the way. Thanks so much for your attendance and attention this afternoon, and here are some contact details and things that you might like to do if you'd like more information in future.